Can you imagine a world where your very existence could be shattered by a rumor, where your dignity and future hung by a thread, simply because you were a woman? What if the laws of your land in the year 1260 were designed to protect some, yet utterly destroy others, based solely on gender? Number 1. The unequal grounds for divorce and annulment. Imagine a quiet, stone-walled village nestled in a valley, its houses huddled together beneath the watchful gaze of a lord's castle in the year 1260. Life here for most was a relentless cycle of planting, harvesting, and enduring. For a woman, her entire life was often dictated by her marriage, a sacred bond not easily broken. Yet the very laws governing this bond were tilted so starkly, they could make your stomach churn. When it came to the ultimate dissolution of a marriage, a husband held a power his wife could only dream of. Picture Elara, a young woman who had been married off at 16 to Thomas, a gruff farmer twice her age, in a union arranged for land and status, not affection. After 5 years, Thomas, tiring of Elara's quiet demeanor, began spending his nights in the nearby town at the inn, openly consorting with women who were not his wife. The whispers reached Elara, then became shouts. He hardly concealed his affairs, treating them as casual diversions, a man's prerogative. The village saw it, the local priest knew it, yet what recourse did Elara have? Thomas, if Elara were to so much as exchange a lingering glance with another man, or worse, be found alone with one under suspicious circumstances, he could immediately petition the church court for an annulment or even a divorce. The grounds would be clear: her supposed adultery. His standing in the community, his property, his reputation, all would be largely preserved, perhaps even enhanced by his apparent righteous indignation. Cast her out, take back her dowry, and within a year, be looking for a new wife to bear him more sons. The process, while not entirely simple, was a well-trodden path for men seeking to rid themselves of an inconvenient wife or a marriage that had ceased to be beneficial. The social norms supported him. A wife's infidelity was a direct assault on his honor and his lineage, a corruption of his very bloodline. The law, reflecting these norms, provided a swift, if brutal, remedy. Now, consider Elara's situation. Thomas's open and numerous infidelities caused her immense pain and public shame. Her friends avoided her, not knowing what to say. Family, who had seen her marriage as a step up, now looked at her with pity, almost disappointment. She wanted out. She desired release from a union that offered her no respect, no love, and certainly no fidelity. She petitioned for a divorce or annulment based on Thomas's adultery. The answer, devastatingly, was almost always a resounding no. 1260, the church, while holding marriage as a sacrament, allowed for separation from bed and board, divortium immensa et thoro, in cases of extreme cruelty or adultery, but rarely a full annulment, which implied the marriage was never valid. However, the application of these rules was profoundly gendered. A man's sexual transgressions, even repeated ones, were frequently seen as different from a woman's. His actions might be considered fornication or concubinage, sins against God, but not necessarily a fundamental breach of the marital contract that would dissolve it from his side as it would from her. Primary concern for a man's infidelity was often if he had an illegitimate child who might later claim his property or title, thereby disrupting the proper lineage. It was a matter of inheritance and social order, not a direct challenge to the sacred bond in the same way a wife's actions were. Elara's plea to the local ecclesiastical court, if she even dared to make one, would likely be met with confusion, perhaps even scorn. The priest would inquire about her own conduct, her dutifulness as a wife. She would be told to endure, to pray, to understand that a man's nature was different, that God allowed for certain transgressions from men, but demanded purity from women. She might be advised to reconcile, to turn a blind eye, to pray for her husband's soul. The idea of a wife initiating divorce proceedings based on her husband's infidelity was almost unheard of, a societal anomaly. A wife was expected to tolerate, to submit, to maintain the household regardless of her husband's moral failings. Honor was inextricably linked to her husband's, and challenging him in such a fundamental way was seen as a challenge to the entire social fabric, not simply a personal grievance. Pleas would likely fall on deaf ears, leaving her trapped in a desolate, humiliating marriage with no legal path to escape, a stark contrast to the swift, decisive action her husband could have taken against her. Number 2, the church's role, conflicting ideals versus secular reality for women. Imagine stepping into a medieval cathedral in 1260. the air thick with incense, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows, illuminating figures of saints and biblical stories. Church in this era was an omnipresent force, shaping not just spiritual life, but also law, morality, and social order. Teachings profoundly influenced perceptions of marriage, fidelity, and sin. On one hand, the church preached a strict ideal. Marriage was a sacred sacrament, a lifelong union between one man and one woman, blessed by God. Both men and women were exhorted to uphold fidelity, and adultery, for both genders, was considered a grievous sin against the divine law. Confessional box, a place of private reckoning, would hear confessions of infidelity from both husbands and wives, and penance would be prescribed regardless of gender. Yet now picture the dusty, crowded hall of a secular court, perhaps in a bustling town square or within the castle walls, far from the hallowed sanctity of the cathedral. Here the laws were administered by a lord, a sheriff, or a royal judge, influenced by tradition, local customs, and the practicalities of land ownership and social hierarchy. And it was here that the ideals of the church often collided head-on with the brutal realities of secular power, creating a system that was glaringly unfair to women. Take the case of Isabel, a baker's wife, known for her sharp wit and even sharper bread. Rumors began to circulate in her town that she had been seen too often, too late, with a traveling merchant, a man with a charming smile and wares from distant lands. Her husband, Pierre, a taciturn man who valued his reputation above all else, caught wind of these whispers. He was furious, his honor wounded, his name dragged through the mud. For him, the path was clear. He would bring Isabel before the local lord's court, accusing her of adultery. He sought not only to punish her, but to rid himself of a wife who had, in his eyes, defiled his household and threatened his lineage. The secular court, unlike the confessional, was not primarily concerned with the spiritual state of Isabel's soul, nor with Pierre's, for that matter. Primary function was to maintain social order, protect property rights, and uphold the patriarchal structure of society. When Isabel was brought before the Lord, the accusation of adultery immediately placed her in a perilous position. The evidence might be flimsy whispers, a neighbor's half-seen glimpse, a jealous comment. The burden of proof, effectively, fell on Isabel to disprove the accusation. Character, her modesty, her entire life history would be scrutinized. Found guilty, the penalties would be severe: loss of her dowry, public shaming, perhaps even banishment or a more brutal physical punishment. Her life as she knew it would be utterly destroyed, her future bleak and hopeless. Now, consider Pierre's behavior. What if Pierre himself was known to frequent the local tavern, not just for ale, but for the company of other women, perhaps even a mistress he kept in a nearby village? Church, consistent in its doctrine, would consider Pierre's actions a sin, just as it would Isabel. He would be expected to confess, to perform penance, to seek forgiveness. However, if Isabel, driven by desperation and a desire for justice, were to bring Pierre's infidelity before the secular court, what would happen? The Lord's court would likely dismiss her complaint, or at best, treat it with far less gravity. A man's extramarital affairs, while perhaps frowned upon socially, were rarely considered a crime deserving of severe secular punishment. His actions did not, in the eyes of the law, invalidate his marriage in the same fundamental way a woman's did. His children were still legitimate, his property still secure. His honor, while perhaps momentarily tarnished by gossip, was not obliterated. He might receive a stern talking to from the priest, a requirement to pay a fine to the church, or a period of fasting and prayer. But he would not face the threat of losing his land, his home, or his social standing. He would not be publicly humiliated, his head shaven, or his body marked. The secular authorities were interested in maintaining the stability of land ownership and lineage, which a man's adultery rarely threatened directly, whereas a woman's could introduce a bastard heir into the family line. Glaring disparity revealed the chasm between church doctrine and secular reality. While the church aimed for a moral ideal of mutual fidelity, the practical application of laws in the 1260 world reflected and reinforced a deeply patriarchal society. A man's sin was a matter for his soul and God's judgment, perhaps a penance. A woman's alleged sin was a matter for public justice, societal retribution, and the profound destruction of her earthly existence. Church might preach equality in sin, but the world's laws delivered anything but equality in punishment. especially when it came to accusations of adultery against women. Number 3, the threat of physical mutilation and bodily harm as a penalty for women. Imagine the fear, a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in a woman's bones if she was accused of adultery in 1260. The threat was not just of public shaming or financial ruin, though those were horrific enough. For women, the very integrity of their bodies, their physical safety, hung in the balance, a terrifying specter that hovered over every rumor and accusation. Punishments could be brutally visceral, designed not only to punish the individual, but to serve as a stark, gruesome warning to all other women in the community. Consider the case of Agnes, a young woman from a small, isolated hamlet, whose husband, a quick-tempered miller, grew suspicious after she spent an afternoon helping a lonely widower repair his roof. The miller, fueled by wine and gossip, accused her before the local lord. The lord, a harsh man known for his rigid interpretations of justice, was quick to condemn. He saw Agnes's perceived transgression not just as a breach of marital vows, but as an affront to the established order, a stain on the community's moral purity. The sentence handed down to Agnes, if proven guilty, and remember how difficult it was for a woman to prove her innocence, could be utterly horrifying. One of the most infamous punishments, though not universally applied, involved the disfigurement of her face. Imagine her nose being slit or her ears being cut off. This was not merely about inflicting pain, it was about branding her for life, marking her as an adulteress for all to see. Her beauty, her identity, her very humanity would be permanently marred. She would walk through life as a living testament to her alleged sin, a constant, visible warning to others. Her face, once her own, became a public canvas for societal condemnation. How could she ever find peace? How could she ever recover from such a brutal, permanent mutilation? Every glance she received, every whispered comment would be a fresh reminder of her living nightmare. Beyond disfigurement, the penalties could escalate. In some regions, depending on the severity of the alleged offense and the local customs, women accused of adultery could face much harsher, even fatal, punishments. While outright execution for adultery might have been less common by 1260 than in earlier, more barbaric times, it was by no means unheard of, particularly in areas where local lords held significant, almost absolute, power and subscribed to particularly strict moral codes. Imagine being dragged to the gallows, or facing a swift, brutal death, all because of an accusation, perhaps even a false one, that you had been unfaithful to your husband. Fear of such an end, a public execution, served as a potent deterrent, forcing women into absolute compliance and fear of even the appearance of impropriety. Now let's contrast this with the consequences a man faced for adultery. Agnes's husband, the miller, were caught in the act of infidelity, perhaps even assaulting another woman. What physical punishment would he face? Almost certainly none. His actions, while perhaps considered sinful by the church and socially frowned upon, rarely, if ever, led to physical mutilation, public floggings, or the threat of execution by secular law. He might face a fine, a public reprimand from the priest, or a penance in the church. His body, however, remained his own, untouched by the brutal hand of public justice. His face would remain unscarred, his limbs intact. He would carry no permanent physical mark of his transgression. His physical person was not seen as a public commodity to be defiled or punished in the same way a woman's was. This stark disparity reveals a horrifying truth about justice in 1260. A woman's body was viewed as property, first of her father, then of her husband. Her sexual fidelity was paramount, not just for moral reasons, but for the purity of the family line and the legitimacy of heirs. Any deviation from this was seen as a profound violation that necessitated extreme, often violent, physical retribution to restore order and purity. A man's body, on the other hand, was his own, largely immune from such invasive and destructive state-sanctioned violence for sexual misconduct. The very threat of physical mutilation and death loomed over women in a way that men simply never had to contemplate for the same crime, making the adultery laws a terrifying instrument of patriarchal control. Number 4, the absence of true legal recourse or voice for accused women. Imagine standing in a medieval court in 1260, a cavernous hall filled with the murmurs of men. The air is heavy with the scent of damp stone and unwashed bodies. You are a woman accused of a transgression that could ruin your life, perhaps even end it. But as you look around, you realize a terrifying truth. There is no one there to speak for you, no one to truly listen to your side of the story, and certainly no fair chance to defend yourself against the overwhelming power of the system. This was the crushing reality for women accused of adultery. They were, in essence, silenced by the very legal apparatus designed to dispense justice. Consider the plight of Marjorie, a skilled weaver, whose intricate tapestries were admired throughout the town. Her husband, Reginald, a merchant of modest means, accused her of adultery with a wealthy nobleman who had commissioned a large piece. Reginald sought not only revenge for his wounded pride, but also financial compensation from the nobleman, perhaps even an annulment to reclaim Marjorie's valuable dowry. Marjorie vehemently denied the accusation, claiming she had only ever met the nobleman in the presence of her servants and apprentices, strictly for business discussions about the tapestry. When Marjorie was brought before the court, which would typically be presided over by a lord, a sheriff, or a local bailiff, the deck was stacked against her from the very start. First, there was the simple, devastating fact that women in 1260 generally had very limited legal standing. They could not typically act as fully independent legal persons in court, especially in matters of property or personal reputation, unless they were widows or single women of substantial means, and even then, their rights were often constrained. A married woman like Marjorie was legally subsumed under her husband's authority. She was his feme covert, meaning she had no independent legal identity. Could she possibly defend herself when her very voice, her very person, was legally diminished? She could not hire her own advocate or lawyer in the modern sense. Legal representation, where it existed, was rudimentary and typically available only to men of means, or those with significant connections. Even if a man were to speak for her, his primary loyalty might be to the husband, to the prevailing social order, or simply to maintaining the status quo, not to the accused woman's individual rights or truth. Marjorie would likely be expected to stand before the male judges, her accusers, and a gallery of onlookers, and respond directly to the charges. Testimony, even if she spoke eloquently and truthfully, was often discounted or viewed with suspicion. A woman's word, especially in matters of sexual morality, was not given the same weight as a man's. She was often seen as inherently weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and thus less reliable as a witness. Her denials might be interpreted as further evidence of her deceit. Imagine trying to explain subtle nuances of interaction, or the innocent nature of a conversation, to a court of men already predisposed to believe the worst about an accused woman. Any slight hesitation, any faltering in her voice, could be taken as a sign of guilt. Furthermore, the legal process itself provided almost no avenues for a woman to actively pursue justice or build a defense. She couldn't easily call witnesses to testify on her behalf. Those who might speak for her, perhaps her female apprentices or servants, would also have diminished legal standing or be intimidated into silence. She couldn't cross-examine her accusers effectively. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was far from universally applied, especially for women accused of moral transgressions. Instead, the accusation itself carried immense weight, often acting as a virtual conviction in the court of public opinion, and frequently in the eyes of the law. Contrast Marjorie's situation with Reginald's. If Reginald were accused of a crime, he would have some ability, albeit limited by the era, to seek legal counsel, to call witnesses who could speak for him, to use his male standing in society to gain a more sympathetic hearing. His word as a man would carry more weight. The legal system, though imperfect for everyone, was fundamentally designed by men, for men, and operated on principles that favored male authority and property rights above all else. For a woman, simply being heard, truly heard, was an impossibility, leaving her utterly vulnerable, isolated, and without a true voice to plead her case in a system that offered her no genuine recourse. Number 5. The double standard in defining the act itself and its legality. Imagine a definition of a crime that changes dramatically based on who commits it. In 1260, the very understanding of what constituted adultery was skewed so profoundly that it became a cornerstone of injustice against women. For a married woman, the act of sexual intimacy with any man other than her husband was the essence of adultery, a profound violation with devastating legal and social consequences. For a married man, the definition of his sexual misconduct was often far more lenient, nuanced, or simply not even considered adultery in the same legally binding sense, especially if the other woman was unmarried. Picture Elara, a nobleman's wife, whose life revolved around managing her household, raising her children, and upholding her family's reputation. One unfortunate evening, during a tumultuous period of political unrest, she was coerced into an illicit liaison, perhaps even assaulted, by a powerful lord who had taken advantage of her vulnerability and her husband's temporary absence. The whispers began, then grew louder, until they reached her husband. For Elara, the accusation of adultery meant the complete destruction of her life. Her husband could immediately disavow her, seize her dowry, potentially banish her, or worse. Perceived sin, even if it was coerced or a single, momentary lapse, was a profound legal and moral breach that threatened the purity of his lineage and his claim to his property. Her body, her fidelity, was legally and socially perceived as directly linked to the legitimacy of his heirs and the sanctity of his property rights. The legal definition of adultery, as applied to women, was stark and absolute. It was a breach of her vows, a defilement of the marriage bed, and a threat to the clarity of inheritance. Consequences were severe precisely because her perceived transgression could introduce an illegitimate child into the family line, one who might then lay claim to property or titles that belonged to her husband's legitimate heirs. The law in this context was an instrument to protect male property rights and patriarchal lineage above all else. Now, let's turn the tables. Imagine Elara's husband, Lord Arthur, a man of considerable influence. Frequently traveled, and on these journeys, he might take up with a mistress or engage in casual encounters with women who were not his wife. Perhaps he even kept a concubine in a separate dwelling, providing for her and any children she bore him, a common practice among wealthier men. Would his actions be considered adultery in the same legal and actionable way that Elara's actions would be? For the most part, no. 1260, a married man's sexual relations with an unmarried woman, while a sin in the eyes of the church, fornication, was rarely classified as adultery in secular law. Adultery was primarily concerned with the purity of the marital bed and the legitimacy of heirs. A man's extramarital relations with an unmarried woman did not threaten his lineage. Any children born from such unions were illegitimate and had no claim to his property or titles. His actions might be viewed as a moral failing, a personal sin, but they did not carry the same profound legal implications for his marriage or his property as a wife's infidelity did. He would not face legal consequences that would force a divorce, nor would he lose his property, nor would his standing in society be severely diminished. Furthermore, if a man had sexual relations with another married woman, that would be considered adultery, but the legal focus and the severe penalties would overwhelmingly fall on her, the married woman, and sometimes on her lover, but rarely on the married man himself in terms of shattering his marriage or ruining his life. He might face a fine or a religious penance, but his marriage would largely remain intact, and his wife would have no grounds for legal action against him that would lead to divorce or financial recompense. This double standard was deeply ingrained in the legal and social fabric of the time. The law was not designed to uphold universal fidelity as an equal expectation for both genders. Instead, it was designed to protect male property, male lineage, and male honor, placing the entire burden of sexual purity and fidelity almost exclusively on the shoulders of women. A man's sexual transgressions were seen as unfortunate, but largely inconsequential to the legal structure of marriage and inheritance, while a woman's were seen as a direct attack on the very foundations of her husband's social and economic standing, rendering her vulnerable to the most brutal forms of legal retribution. Number 6, the dire consequences for a woman's children and legacy. Imagine being a mother in 1260, living in an age where your children were not just your flesh and blood, but also your legacy, your comfort in old age, and your connection to the future. Now imagine that your very right to these children, your maternal bond, and even their own future prospects could be ripped away from you, not by death, but by a simple accusation of adultery. This was a horrifying reality for women, a profound layer of injustice that deeply affected not just their own lives, but the lives of the innocent children they cherished. Consider Johanna, a farmer's wife, who had 2 bright-eyed children, a son and a daughter, who were her pride and joy. She had nurtured them, taught them, and poured her entire life into their upbringing. Her husband, Thomas, a stern and unforgiving man, accused her of adultery with a traveling tinker who had passed through their village. The accusation, whether true or false, immediately cast a dark shadow over Johanna's entire life, and tragically, over her children's too. Upon conviction, the consequences for Johanna were catastrophic, and they extended directly to her children. In most cases, a woman found guilty of adultery would lose all rights to her children. They would remain with her husband, the wronged party, to be raised without their mother. Imagine the agony of being forcibly separated from your own offspring, perhaps never to see them again, their faces slowly fading from your memory as you endured banishment or imprisonment. The law saw children as belonging to the father, the head of the household, and a mother deemed unfaithful was seen as unfit to raise them, having allegedly tainted the family honor. Children were regarded as part of the father's property and lineage, to be protected from the alleged stain of a mother's infidelity. Furthermore, the very legitimacy of her children could be questioned, even if they were undoubtedly fathered by her husband. The accusation of adultery against the mother cast a general cloud of suspicion. While it was the husband who would formally declare a child illegitimate if he believed it was not his, a mother's conviction for adultery opened the door to such declarations. If a child was declared illegitimate, their future was dire. They would be denied inheritance rights, unable to claim their father's land, titles, or property. They would face significant social stigma, often being shunned or relegated to the lowest rungs of society, their opportunities for marriage or advancement severely limited. The sin of the mother effectively condemned her innocent children to a lifetime of struggle and social exclusion. The loss of children was not just a personal tragedy for the woman, it was also the utter destruction of her legacy. In a society where women's influence and contribution were often channeled through their roles as wives and mothers, being stripped of her children meant the erasure of her future presence in the family line. Her name would be tarnished, remembered as an adulteress, and her children would be raised to believe she was a source of shame if they were allowed to remember her at all. Influence on their lives, her very memory within the family, would be systematically eradicated. Now, let's starkly contrast this with a man's adultery. Johanna's husband, Thomas, were found to be living openly with a mistress and had children by her. Those children would simply be considered illegitimate. They would have no claim on Thomas's property or his legitimate family. His legitimate children with Johanna, however, would remain entirely secure in their status and inheritance. Thomas's infidelity, while a sin, would not cause him to lose his children from his marriage. He would remain the undisputed head of his household, and his paternal rights would be completely unaffected. His legitimate children would not suffer any social stigma or loss of inheritance due to his sexual transgression. Their future, their status, their legacy would remain intact, utterly untouched by their father's actions. The stark disparity illustrates how profoundly the laws of adultery were designed to control female sexuality and protect male lineage and property. A woman's alleged infidelity had the power to sever her most fundamental bond, that with her children, and to condemn those children to a life of hardship, while a man's infidelity carried no such profound consequences for his offspring or his patriarchal authority. For women, the cost of an accusation went far beyond themselves, extending to the very children they loved and protected, leaving them utterly vulnerable to profound, lifelong anguish and loss. Number 7, the unbearable social stigma and public humiliation reserved exclusively for women. Imagine living in a world where your reputation was your most valuable possession, more precious than gold, more vital than good health. In 1260, particularly for a woman, honor and reputation were meticulously guarded. A single whisper, a fleeting rumor, could shatter it entirely, leaving you utterly broken and outcast. When it came to accusations of adultery, the social stigma and public humiliation inflicted upon women were meticulously crafted to ensure maximum suffering, serving as a brutal example to the entire community, while men often escaped with little more than a raised eyebrow. Consider the case of Isolde, a woman of gentle birth, married to a minor lord, whose position in society depended entirely on her perceived virtue and piety. A rival family, seeking to undermine her husband's standing, spread malicious rumors that Isolde had secretly entertained a younger knight during her husband's absence. The rumors escalated, reaching a fever pitch. Soon, the entire district was abuzz with speculation. Once the accusation was formalized, and often even before any legal conviction, Isolde's life would begin to unravel with excruciating swiftness. She would be shunned by society. Female friends, fearing contamination by association or simply eager to distance themselves from scandal, would turn away. Invitations to social gatherings would cease. Even going to the village market would become an ordeal, met with hostile glares, muttered insults, and pointing fingers. She would be forced to walk through life as a pariah, branded by the whispers of her supposed sin, but the humiliation was often far more public and deliberate. Convicted, the penalties were designed to inflict maximum public shame. Imagine Isolde being forced to wear a distinctive mark or garment, perhaps a badge or a specific piece of clothing, that identified her as an adulteress. She might be forced to parade through the streets of her town, her head shaven as a sign of her disgrace, her clothing ragged, while villagers jeered, threw refuse, and hurled insults. This public ritual of shaming was a deliberate act, meant to break her spirit, to strip her of any remaining dignity, and to engrave her alleged sin into the collective memory of the community. It was not enough for her to be punished. She had to be made an object lesson, a living embodiment of the consequences of female transgression. Her reputation was not just damaged, it was utterly annihilated, leaving her with no hope of ever restoring her place in respectable society. Even if she later remarried or found a new home, the mark of her past would follow her, a constant, crushing burden. Now, let's contrast this with Isolde's husband, the Lord. If he were known to have a string of mistresses, or to openly frequent brothels in larger towns, what would be the social impact on him? While his confessor might urge penance, and some pious members of the community might shake their heads, his social standing would likely remain largely intact. For a man, a degree of sexual promiscuity was often tolerated, even seen as a sign of virility, a natural expression of male appetite. His honor, unlike his wife's, was not solely dependent on his sexual fidelity. It was tied to his martial prowess, his land ownership, his ability to provide for his family, and his political influence. His casual infidelities were not seen as threatening his lineage or his property in the same way a woman's could. He would not be subjected to public shaming rituals. His head would not be shaved. He would not be forced to wear a mark of shame or be paraded through the streets to the jeers of the crowd. His social invitations would not cease. His male companions might even joke about his exploits, offering congratulations rather than condemnation. The concept of honor for a man was far more robust, capable of weathering personal moral failings that would utterly destroy a woman's standing. His reputation, though perhaps slightly tarnished by gossip, would quickly recover, absorbed by his other, more important societal roles and achievements. The stark asymmetry in social stigma and public humiliation highlights the profound injustice of the adultery laws in 1260. For women, an accusation meant absolute social annihilation, a deliberate stripping away of dignity and belonging. For men, the same act, or even a far more egregious pattern of behavior, was often met with little more than a shrug, revealing a society that ruthlessly controlled female bodies and reputations, while granting men broad immunity from similar public condemnation. Number 8. The economic ruin and property seizure facing accused women. Imagine a life where your economic security, your very ability to survive, was entirely dependent on your husband's good graces and your impeccable reputation. In 1260, for a married woman, this was not a metaphor, it was a stark, daily reality. The moment an accusation of adultery was leveled against her, even before conviction, her economic world could collapse around her with terrifying speed, leaving her utterly destitute, while her husband's wealth remained untouched, perhaps even growing from her downfall. Consider the story of Beatrice, a merchant's daughter, who had brought a substantial dowry into her marriage with Robert, a rising craftsman known for his finely carved chests. Her dowry, which might consist of land, money, livestock, or valuable goods, was meant to be her contribution to the marriage, providing for her future and her family's security. It represented her potential economic power, though legally, it typically passed into her husband's control upon marriage. After years of marriage, Robert accused Beatrice of adultery, perhaps fueled by greed, seeing a convenient way to get rid of her and keep her dowry for himself without the need for a divorce or the complex legal battles surrounding it. The moment Beatrice was accused and subsequently convicted of adultery, the primary legal consequence, beyond the immediate shame and potential physical punishment, was the outright forfeiture of her dowry. This was a critical aspect of the law. Dowry, which legally belonged to her husband during the marriage, was often understood to revert to her family upon her husband's death, or be returned to her if the marriage was annulled for reasons other than her fault. But if she was found guilty of adultery, she lost all claim to it. Imagine having your entire economic worth, the sum total of your family's contribution to your marriage, simply vanish. She would be left with nothing, literally nothing but the clothes on her back. Not only did she lose her dowry, but she also lost any claim to dower rights. Dower rights were the portion of her husband's property, typically 1/3 of his land or estate, that a widow was legally entitled to for her sustenance after her husband's death. This was meant to ensure her financial security should she outlive him. For a woman convicted of adultery, these rights were instantly extinguished. She would have no claim to any of her husband's property, no matter how much she might have contributed to its management or prosperity during their marriage. She would be cast out from the household, without land, without money, without any means of support, forced to rely on charity, or to seek meager employment as a servant living hand to mouth in a society that offered little compassion to disgraced women. Her economic ruin was absolute and irreversible. Contrast this stark reality with Robert's situation. If Robert were accused of adultery, a highly unlikely scenario in the first place given the gendered definition of the crime, what would be the economic consequences for him? None whatsoever. His wealth, his land, his workshop, his status as a craftsman, all would remain entirely his own. He would not forfeit any property to his wife, nor would his business ventures be jeopardized. His infidelity, even if publicly known, would not result in the seizure of his assets or the loss of his livelihood. He would continue to operate his business, maintain his household, and enjoy his economic standing without interruption. In fact, in many cases, a husband might even benefit financially from accusing his wife of adultery. He could effectively discard a wife he no longer desired, retain her dowry, and be free to seek a new wife, perhaps one with an even larger dowry. The law, therefore, not only punished women economically, but also provided an incentive for unscrupulous men to level accusations, knowing they could profit from their wife's downfall. The economic devastation inflicted upon women accused of adultery in 1260 was a brutal reflection of a legal system that saw women primarily as conduits for property and lineage, rather than independent economic beings. By stripping them of their dowry and dower rights, the law ensured that women were utterly dependent on male benevolence and perfect moral conduct, leaving them vulnerable to complete destitution at the whim of an accusation, while their male counterparts remained economically secure, regardless of their own actions. Number 9. The sheer impossibility of a woman's accusation of a man's adultery. Imagine living in a world where a wrong committed against you, no matter how painful or evident, could not even be acknowledged by the law if you were a woman. 1260, one of the most profound and pervasive injustices in the adultery laws was the practical impossibility, or at least the severe disincentive, for a woman to accuse her husband of adultery and expect any meaningful legal or societal redress. The legal framework simply did not recognize a man's sexual infidelity in the same way, nor did it grant women the standing to challenge it effectively. Consider the story of Avelina, a respected baker's wife in a bustling market town. Her husband, Cuthbert, a successful and well-regarded merchant, had for years openly kept a mistress in a neighboring village, fathering several children with her. Cuthbert even visited them frequently, and the situation was an open secret among his business associates and most of the town. Avelina was deeply hurt, publicly humiliated, and felt betrayed. She believed her husband's actions were just as much a violation of their marriage vows as any act she might commit. She longed for justice, for a recognition of her suffering, and perhaps even for separation or financial support. Now, if Avelina were to approach the local secular court, or even the church court, with an accusation of adultery against Cuthbert, what would happen? The response would likely be dismissive, almost certainly unhelpful. The very definition of adultery in the secular legal framework of 1260 was heavily skewed. As we discussed, a married man's sexual relations with an unmarried woman, concubinage or fornication, was not considered adultery in the same actionable legal sense as a married woman's sexual relations with any man other than her husband. His actions did not threaten the legitimacy of his heirs within his marriage or the integrity of his property line. His children with his mistress would be illegitimate, posing no threat to the inheritance of his children with Evelina. The legal system was fundamentally concerned with maintaining the purity of male lineage and the security of male property, not with upholding a strict, equal standard of marital fidelity for both genders. Furthermore, even if the church courts might theoretically acknowledge Cuthbert's actions as a sin, the practical application of their judgments was different. He might be ordered to perform penance, perhaps a fine, or a period of fasting. But he would not face the threat of divorce initiated by Evelina, nor would he lose his property or his social standing. The church, while holding lofty ideals, often yielded to the practicalities of secular power and the deeply ingrained patriarchal norms of the time. The idea of a wife being able to legally force her husband to change his ways or to suffer severe consequences for his infidelity was almost unthinkable. Evelina's very act of accusation might even backfire on her. By publicly challenging her husband, she would be seen as undermining his authority, disrupting the social order, and being a difficult or unruly wife. Such behavior could make her vulnerable to counter-accusations from Cuthbert or from others in society, perhaps even accusations of insubordination or challenging her husband's rightful place as head of the household. She might be advised by her family, by her priest, or by well-meaning neighbors to simply endure, to pray for her husband's soul, and to accept his actions as part of the natural order of things. Her suffering was to be silently borne, not openly challenged in a legal forum that was never designed to address it. The lack of legal standing for women to accuse their husbands effectively meant that male adultery, while perhaps a moral failing, was not a legally actionable crime, with serious consequences for the man. His freedom to engage in extramarital affairs, particularly with unmarried women, was largely unchecked by the law. This created a profound power imbalance within marriage, where a man could openly flout his vows with impunity, while his wife lived under the constant threat of total destruction should she commit a similar, or even a far less egregious, perceived transgression. The legal system, by its very structure and definition, ensured that a woman's anguish over her husband's infidelity remained a private, unaddressable sorrow, while a man's accusations against his wife could ignite a public firestorm of devastating legal and social consequences.